Every morning, as the sun began to rise over the small town of Millbrook, 93-year-old Harold Bennett followed the same routine he had kept for the past 30 years. His wrinkled hands would grip the steering wheel of his perfectly maintained 1975 Cadillac Sedan DeVille, a car that shone like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. The old vehicle was more than just transportation. It was a reminder of a time when things were built to last, just like Harold himself. At exactly 7 o'clock a.m., Harold would pull into the parking lot of Joe's Corner Cafe. The gravel would crunch under his tires as he carefully parked in the same spot, third from the door, where the morning sun wouldn't hit his windshield. His movements were slow but purposeful, each step taken with the careful precision that only comes with age and wisdom. The small bell above the cafe door would ring as he pushed it open, announcing his arrival to the familiar faces inside. "Morning, Mr. Bennett." Sarah, the young waitress with kind eyes and a gentle smile, would call out every day. She had started working at the cafe 5 years ago, and from her first day, she had taken a special liking to the elderly veteran. Harold would tip his worn navy blue veteran's cap to her, a small gesture that carried the weight of old-world manners. His corner booth, the one with the slight tear in the red vinyl seat that had been patched up more times than anyone could count, waited for him like an old friend. The morning light filtered through the cafe's large windows, casting a warm glow on the wooden table where countless cups of coffee had left their marks over the years. "The usual, Mr. Bennett?" Sarah would ask, even though she already knew the answer. Harold's order hadn't changed in 3 decades. Black coffee, 2 slices of wheat toast, light on the butter, and the daily newspaper. He would nod, his blue eyes twinkling with the kind of warmth that made everyone around him feel at ease. While waiting for his breakfast, Harold would carefully remove his reading glasses from their protective case, wiping them clean with the soft handkerchief he always carried in his breast pocket. The other regular customers would wave or nod in his direction. Mr. Johnson from the hardware store, Mrs. Peterson who ran the library, and Tom the mailman who always stopped in for his morning coffee before starting his route. The cafe felt like a second home to Harold. The walls were decorated with old photographs of the town, and in one corner, there was a small display of military memorabilia. Harold's own photograph, taken during his service in World War II, hung among them. In it, a young Harold stood proud in his Marine Corps uniform, his face serious but his eyes holding the same kindness they carried today. As Sarah brought his coffee and toast, Harold would unfold his newspaper with careful precision. His hands, though marked with age spots and lined with veins that told stories of a life well lived, were still steady. He would start with the front page, then move to the local news, and finally end with the crossword puzzle, though he never filled it in, preferring to solve it in his mind. Other customers would come and go, the morning rush bringing the sounds of clinking plates and friendly conversation. The smell of bacon and coffee would fill the air, mixing with the sweet scent of Mary's famous apple pie cooling on the counter. Through it all, Harold remained in his corner, a quiet observer of life's daily parade. Few people knew the full story of the elderly man who sat in that corner booth. They didn't know about the medals carefully stored in a box under his bed, or the nightmares that sometimes still woke him in the dark hours of the morning. They didn't know about the missions he'd led, the lives he'd saved, or the friends he'd lost. To them, he was simply Mr. Bennett, the kind old veteran who read his paper every morning and always had a gentle smile for everyone he met. But life has a way of bringing unexpected changes, even to the most settled of routines. Harold didn't know it yet, but this peaceful morning ritual was about to face a disruption that would test his patience, challenge his dignity, and ultimately lead to one of the most important decisions of his later years. As he sat there, sipping his coffee and reading about the world beyond Millbrook, Harold Bennett had no idea that his quiet life was about to become the talk of the town. The peaceful mornings at Joe's Corner Cafe changed on a Tuesday in early October. Harold was in his usual corner booth when the loud rumble of motorcycle engines shattered the quiet morning air. The windows of the cafe vibrated as 5 large motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. Sarah, who was refilling Harold's coffee cup, paused mid-pour as the cafe's door swung open with a bang instead of its usual gentle ring. 5 men walked in, their heavy boots leaving mud on the clean floor that Mary had just mopped. They wore black leather jackets covered in patches, chains hanging from their belt loops, and their arms were decorated with dark tattoos. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard and a bandana tied around his head, scanned the cafe with cold eyes. His name patch read Steele, and the other customers quickly looked down at their plates when his gaze passed over them. Behind him, his friends, equally intimidating in their appearance, spread out to occupy the largest booth in the cafe. "Hey, Grandma," Steele called out to Sarah, who was still standing by Harold's table. "5 coffees, and make it quick." His voice was rough, and he laughed when Sarah jumped slightly at his tone. Harold watched as she hurried away, her hands trembling as she grabbed the coffee pot. The bikers were loud, their voices drowning out the usual morning chatter. They told crude jokes and used language that made Mrs. Peterson gather her things and leave without finishing her breakfast. Tom the mailman quickly drank his coffee and left through the side door, avoiding eye contact with the newcomers. Harold continued reading his newspaper, though his grip on the pages was tighter than usual. He could feel the bikers watching him, their whispers and snickers carrying across the room. One of them, a younger man with a shaved head, pointed at Harold's veteran's cap and made a comment that caused his friends to laugh loudly. "Hey, old-timer," Steele called out. "That seat's been warming long enough. Why don't you make room for people who actually have somewhere to be?" His friends laughed again, the sound harsh and unfriendly in the usually peaceful cafe. Harold slowly folded his newspaper and placed it beside his coffee cup. He looked at Steele with calm eyes, the kind of steadiness that comes from having seen far worse things than a group of troublemakers. Without speaking, he picked up his cup and took another sip of coffee, acting as if he hadn't heard the comment at all. This seemed to annoy Steele even more. He stood up and walked over to Harold's booth, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. "You got hearing problems, old man?" he asked, leaning down so his face was close to Harold's. The smell of leather and cigarette smoke filled the air between them. Sarah watched nervously from behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone. Joe, the cafe's owner, had stepped out to the bank, and she wasn't sure what to do. The other customers sat frozen, their breakfasts forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. Harold set his cup down carefully on its saucer. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, showing no sign of fear or worry. He had faced danger before, in places far from this small-town cafe, and these men, for all their noise and intimidation, were nothing compared to the enemies he had encountered in his younger days. The bikers continued their taunting throughout the morning. They knocked over the sugar container on Harold's table by accident, laughed when some coffee spilled on his newspaper, and made loud comments about retirement homes having better food. Through it all, Harold maintained his dignity, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the slight tension in his jaw, or the way his fingers gripped his coffee cup a little tighter than usual. As Harold finally stood to leave, Steele stuck out his boot, nearly tripping the elderly veteran. Harold caught himself on the edge of the table, his reflexes still sharp despite his age. The bikers roared with laughter, but their amusement died quickly when they saw the look in Harold's eyes. For just a moment, something flickered there, not fear, but something harder, colder, a glimpse of the soldier he had once been. Walking to his car that morning, Harold knew things at Joe's Corner Cafe would never be quite the same. The bikers had marked their territory, and his peaceful morning routine was now under threat. But Harold Bennett hadn't survived a war and 93 years of life by backing down from bullies. As he drove home, his mind was already working on what to do next, drawing on decades of experience and wisdom that his tormentors couldn't begin to understand. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation at Joe's Corner Cafe grew worse with each passing day. The bikers had made the cafe their regular morning spot, always arriving shortly after Harold. They seemed to take special pleasure in making his peaceful breakfast time as unpleasant as possible. On Monday, they accidentally bumped his table so hard that his coffee spilled all over his clean white shirt. Sarah rushed over with a cloth, her eyes filled with worry as she tried to help clean up the mess. Harold simply dabbed at the stain with his handkerchief, his face calm even as the bikers laughed loudly from their booth. "Looks like Grandpa needs a bib," one of them called out, causing another round of cruel laughter. By Wednesday, they'd had started a new game. Whenever Harold would lift his coffee cup to take a sip, one of them would rev their motorcycle engine in the parking lot, trying to make him spill his drink. Harold's hands remained steady, though the coffee rippled in his cup with each loud roar of the engines. The cafe's regular customers had started avoiding the place. Mrs. Peterson now got her morning tea from the gas station across town. Tom the mailman changed his route to skip his morning coffee break, Even Mr. Johnson, who had been coming to the cafe for 40 years, found somewhere else to eat his breakfast. Sarah watched it all with growing distress. She had tried calling the police once, but the bikers hadn't technically broken any laws. They were just being unpleasant, as the young officer had put it. Joe, the cafe owner, was losing business, but he was too afraid of property damage to confront the bikers directly. "Mr. Bennett," Sarah said quietly one morning while refilling his coffee cup, "maybe you should try coming at a different time. Or maybe find another place for a while." Her voice shook slightly as she spoke, showing how much she hated suggesting it. Harold looked up at her with kind eyes. "Thank you for your concern, Sarah," he said softly, "but I've never been one to run from bullies. Not in 1944, and not now." The bikers had overheard this exchange. Steele, their leader, walked over to Harold's booth, dragging a chair from another table and sitting down backwards on it, facing the elderly veteran. "Did you say 1944, old-timer?" Steele asked, his voice mocking. "What did you do in the war? Cook meals? Count supplies?" The other bikers gathered around, creating a threatening circle around Harold's booth. Harold remained silent, calmly folding his newspaper and placing it aside. His blue eyes, still sharp despite his age, met Steele's gaze without flinching. "I bet he was a desk clerk," another biker sneered, reaching out to flick the brim of Harold's veteran's cap. "Probably never saw a day of real action." The cafe had gone completely quiet. Even the usual sounds of cooking from the kitchen had stopped as everyone watched the scene unfold. Sarah stood behind the counter, her hand gripping the phone, ready to call for help if things got worse. Steele leaned closer to Harold, his voice low and threatening. "You know what? I don't think you were even there. I think you're just another old fake wearing a cap you bought at some store. A real veteran would stand up for himself." Harold's hands, resting on the table, curled slowly into fists. Not in anger, but in an effort to control the memories that Steele's words had stirred up. Memories of beaches stained red, of friends lost in distant jungles, of missions so secret they'd never appeared in any history book. The tension in the cafe was broken by the sound of shattering ceramic. One of the bikers had deliberately knocked Harold's coffee cup off the table. It lay broken on the floor, dark coffee spreading across the tiles like a stain. "Oops," the biker said with a cruel smile. "Guess you'll need another cup, if you can afford one on your government handouts." Harold looked down at the broken cup, then at the coffee spreading across the floor. In his long life, he had seen the best and worst of humanity. He had faced death many times, had made decisions that saved lives, and had carried the weight of command on his shoulders. Now, sitting in his corner booth, surrounded by men who didn't understand the first thing about respect or honor, Harold Bennett made another decision. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket pocket. The bikers tensed, uncertain what the old man might be reaching for. What Harold pulled out would change everything, but that moment was still seconds away. The cafe fell into complete silence as Harold's hand moved inside his jacket pocket. Steele and his gang watched nervously, their earlier confidence wavering slightly. Sarah held her breath behind the counter, and even Joe, who had just walked in from the kitchen, stopped in his tracks. Harold's movements were slow and deliberate. His weathered fingers first pulled out an old brown leather wallet. It was worn smooth from decades of use, its edges softened by time. The bikers exchanged confused glances, probably expecting something more dramatic. "A wallet?" Steele laughed, trying to hide his relief. "What are you going to do, old man? Try to buy us off?" Harold didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, he carefully opened the wallet and began removing its contents, laying them on the table one by one. The first item was a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. Next came several black and white photographs, their edges worn but the images still clear. "Look at Grandpa's old pictures," one of the bikers sneered, but Steele held up his hand, silencing him. Something about Harold's calm determination had caught his attention. Harold unfolded the yellowed paper first. It was an official military document, its heading clearly visible. "Top Secret Operation, Pacific Theater, 1944. The stamps and signatures at the bottom were faded but still official-looking. Then he began arranging the photographs. The first showed a group of young Marines in combat gear, their faces serious and determined. In the center stood a tall, strong young man with familiar blue eyes. Harold himself, some 50 years younger. He wore the insignia of a special operations commander. The second photo showed the same group of men, this time in a jungle setting, their uniforms muddy and torn. They were gathered around a captured enemy installation, and in the background, several high-ranking Japanese officers could be seen under guard. Steele leaned forward, his mockery forgotten as he studied the images. His face had gone pale, and his hands, which had been confidently resting on the chair back, now gripped it tightly. The third photograph made several of the bikers step back. It showed Harold's unit receiving medals, but it was the person pinning the medals that caught everyone's attention. General Douglas MacArthur himself, one of the most famous military commanders in history. Harold's hands stayed steady as he laid out one final document. It was a citation for the Navy Cross, one of the highest military honors possible. The citation described an operation where Harold had led his unit behind enemy lines, rescued 15 American prisoners of war, and captured a strategic enemy position. The silence in the cafe was different now. It was no longer tense with fear, but heavy with respect and shame. Steele's face had lost all its arrogance, replaced by a look of growing horror as he realized who they had been tormenting. Commander Harold Bennett, Steele whispered, reading from one of the documents. Leader of the Ghost Unit in the Pacific Theater. 37 successful covert operations. His voice trailed off. Harold finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. I don't wear this cap to brag, he said, touching the brim of his veteran's cap. I wear it to remember. To remember the men I served with, the ones who came home and the ones who didn't. To remember what we fought for, not just freedom, but the right for people to live in peace, without fear of bullies or tyrants. He looked directly at Steele as he continued. In my unit, we had a saying, strength isn't about how tough you act, it's about how you treat those who can't fight back. The biker leader's hands were shaking now. He stood up suddenly, pushing his chair back with a screech that echoed through the quiet cafe. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with himself, then he reached up and pulled off his bandana, revealing a military-style haircut underneath. Sir, Steele said, his voice cracking slightly, my grandfather, he served in the Pacific. He used to tell me stories about a legendary unit, led by a commander who... He couldn't finish the sentence, overwhelmed by the realization of what he and his gang had been doing. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at Harold or their leader. The proud, tough image they had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling in the face of true courage and dignity. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the scene unfold. Joe stood with his mouth open, finally understanding why Harold had remained so calm through all the harassment. The morning sun streamed through the cafe windows, illuminating the photographs on the table. Proof that sometimes the quietest people have the most extraordinary stories to tell. Steele remained standing, his tough biker image completely forgotten as he stared at Harold with a mix of awe and shame. His hands trembled as he reached into his own jacket, pulling out a worn leather wallet similar to Harold's. From it, he took out an old photograph. Sir, Steele said, his voice barely above a whisper, this is my grandfather, James Thompson. He carefully placed the photograph on the table next to Harold's documents. He served in the Pacific. He was a Marine too. Harold picked up the photograph, adjusting his reading glasses. His eyes widened with recognition as he studied the young face in the image. The cafe remained silent as Harold's mind traveled back through decades of memories. James Lucky Thompson, Harold said softly, a smile spreading across his face. Of course, he was one of the best radio operators I ever had. Saved our unit more than once with his quick thinking. He looked up at Steele, seeing the family resemblance for the first time. You have his eyes. Steele sank into the chair across from Harold, his tough guy persona completely gone. My grandfather told me stories about his commander, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He called him the Ghost Commander. Said he could get his men in and out of anywhere without the enemy ever knowing they were there. The other bikers gathered closer, their earlier hostility replaced by curiosity and respect. Sarah quietly brought fresh coffee cups for everyone, and Joe pulled up additional chairs. Your grandfather, Harold continued, pointing to a figure in one of his old photos, was with us during the Mindanao operation. We were trapped behind enemy lines for 3 days. The Japanese had us surrounded, but Lucky, your grandfather, managed to repair a broken radio under heavy fire. Got a message through to headquarters that saved not just our unit, but 300 civilians in the nearby village. Steele wiped his eyes quickly, trying to hide his tears. He told me that story every Christmas. Said his commander carried him half a mile to safety when he got hit by shrapnel after fixing that radio. Harold nodded, his own eyes growing distant with memories. He was too valuable to lose. Not just as a radio operator, but as a man. Your grandfather had something special. He could make the whole unit laugh even in the darkest moments. Kept our spirits up when things seemed hopeless. One of the other bikers, the youngest of the group, spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, my uncle told me about the ghost unit. Said they rescued Poos from a camp that everyone else thought was impossible to reach. Was that your team?" "Operation Kingfisher," Harold confirmed, pulling out another photograph. This one showed a group of emaciated but smiling American soldiers being led through a jungle path. "Your grandfather," he said to Steele, "was key to that mission too. Intercepted enemy communications that helped us find the camp's blind spots." The morning sun continued to rise, casting a warm glow over the gathered group. The usual breakfast crowd had started to arrive, but they stayed quiet, sensing the importance of what was happening in Harold's corner booth. Sarah brought a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of toast, setting them quietly on the table. She noticed how Steele's hands shook as he poured coffee for Harold, the same hands that had so carelessly knocked over Harold's cup just days before. "Sir," Steele said, his voice breaking slightly, "my grandfather passed away 10 years ago, but he always said that everything good in his life, his career, his family, everything, he owed to what he learned from his commander in the Ghost Unit. About honor, about treating people right." He paused, struggling with his words. "And here we've been, disrespecting everything he stood for." Harold reached across the table and placed his hand on Steele's shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud of you for admitting your mistakes," he said gently. "That takes its own kind of courage." The other bikers looked down at their boots, shuffling uncomfortably as the weight of their actions over the past weeks sank in. They had tried so hard to look tough, to be intimidating, but here was a man who had faced real battles, who had led men through real dangers, and he had done it all with quiet dignity. The morning light caught the medals in Harold's photographs, making them shine. But it was the light of understanding in Steele's eyes that truly brightened the cafe that morning, the moment when a lost legacy was rediscovered, and a bridge between generations began to rebuild itself. The next morning at Joe's Corner Cafe was unlike any other in the restaurant's history. Just before 7 a.m., the familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the air, but this time, instead of bringing fear, the sound brought smiles to the faces of those inside. 5 gleaming motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, forming a perfect V formation. Steele and his gang, their leather jackets now clean and neatly worn, waited patiently next to their bikes. When Harold's Cadillac appeared at the corner, they stood at attention, showing a respect that would have seemed impossible just days before. "Good morning, Commander Bennett," Steele called out as Harold parked in his usual spot. The elderly veteran smiled as 2 of the younger bikers rushed to help him out of his car. "At ease, boys," Harold said with a chuckle. "I may be old, but I can still manage to walk to my booth." Inside the cafe, everything had changed. The bikers had arrived early to clean Harold's corner booth until it sparkled. A fresh newspaper was already laid out, and Sarah stood ready with a pot of hot coffee, her face beaming with joy at the transformation she was witnessing. "We have a surprise for you, sir," Steele said as Harold settled into his seat. He nodded to Mike, the youngest biker, who rushed out to his motorcycle and returned with a carefully wrapped package. Harold opened it slowly, his weathered hands carefully removing the paper. Inside was a brand new veteran's cap, similar to his old one but with additional embroidery. Along the side, in golden thread, were the words, "Ghost Unit Commander, Pacific Theater 1944. "We had it specially made," Steele explained, his voice thick with emotion. "The lady at the embroidery shop stayed late last night to finish it. We wanted you to have it before we head to the veteran's home today." Harold held the cap carefully, running his fingers over the stitching. His eyes glistened as he removed his old cap and placed the new one on his head. It fit perfectly. The cafe's regular customers, who had slowly been returning over the past few days, applauded softly. Mrs. Peterson wiped a tear from her eye, and Tom the mailman gave a respectful salute as he passed by the window. "There's more, sir," Mike said excitedly. He pulled out a leather-bound album. We spent all night working on this. Inside the album were carefully arranged photographs, copies of Harold's old war photos alongside new ones taken just yesterday. There were pictures of Steele's grandfather that his family had kept, other veterans' photos contributed by the bikers' relatives, and newspaper clippings about the Ghost Unit's missions that they had managed to find. We want to preserve these stories, sir, Steele explained. Not just yours, but all of them. We're thinking of starting a regular veterans' coffee morning here at Joe's. If that's okay with you, Joe, he added, looking at the cafe owner. Joe, who was standing nearby with tears in his eyes, nodded enthusiastically. Every Thursday morning, he said, the coffee will be on the house for any veteran who wants to join. Harold turned the pages of the album slowly, posing at each photograph. His hands trembled slightly as he recognized faces from long ago, young men who had fought beside him, some who had never made it home. You know, Harold said finally, looking up at the group gathered around his booth. In the war, we had a saying, it's not about how you start the fight, it's about how you finish it. He smiled at Steele. Your grandfather taught me that one. Steele's eyes widened in surprise. He did. Harold nodded. He was right then, and it's still true today. You boys may have started rough, but you're finishing strong. That's what matters. Sarah appeared with fresh coffee for everyone, served in special mugs that the bikers had brought, each one decorated with military branch emblems and American flags. Commander, Steele said, standing up straight, we're ready whenever you are. The bikes are polished, and we've mapped out the best route to the veterans' home. We thought maybe we could take the scenic road, if that's okay with you. Harold finished his coffee and stood up, adjusting his new cap. Well then, boys, he said with a twinkle in his eye, let's move out. The morning sun streamed through the cafe windows as the unlikely group prepared to leave. Regular customers watched in amazement as 5 tough-looking bikers fussed over a 93-year-old veteran, making sure his jacket was warm enough and arguing over who would get the honor of escorting him to his car. Joe's Corner Cafe had seen many changes over the years, but none quite as remarkable as this transformation from intimidation to respect, from fear to friendship, from conflict to redemption. 3 months had passed since that transformative morning at Joe's Corner Cafe. The small restaurant had become something much more than just a place to get breakfast. It had turned into a living museum of military history and a sanctuary for veterans from all around the county. Every Thursday morning, like clockwork, the rumble of Steele's motorcycle group would announce their arrival. But now, instead of bringing fear, they brought veterans from the retirement home, carefully helping them from their specially modified motorcycle sidecars. Harold always sat in the sidecar attached to Steele's bike, wearing his Ghost Unit commander cap with pride. The cafe's walls, once decorated with simple local photographs, now displayed an impressive collection of military memorabilia. Joe had installed proper display cases, each one carefully lit to protect the precious photographs and medals that veterans and their families had proudly contributed. Harold's original Ghost Unit photographs held a place of honor in the center. Commander Bennett. Steele called out one particularly bright morning, helping Harold from the sidecar. We got someone special who wanted to meet you today. A young man in a crisp military uniform stepped forward from behind the group of bikers. He was holding a folder with official military seals. Sir, the young officer said, saluting Harold. I'm Lieutenant Parker from the Marine Corps Historical Division. We've been reading about what's happening here at Joe's Cafe, and... He paused, clearly emotional. Some of your Ghost Unit missions are still teaching materials at Officer Training School. Harold returned the salute, his back straight despite his age. The regular customers and other veterans gathered around, sensing something important was about to happen. Inside the cafe, Sarah had prepared the special veterans section, which now occupied nearly half the restaurant. The original red vinyl booths had been replaced with comfortable seats that were easier for elderly veterans to use. Each table had a small American flag and a framed quote about service and sacrifice. Lieutenant Parker opened his folder as everyone settled in. Sir, the Marine Corps would like to officially document your unit's stories. With your permission, we'd like to record your memories, preserve them for future generations. Steele, who now looked nothing like the intimidating biker who had once terrorized the cafe, beamed with pride. The weekly Veterans Coffee Morning had grown into something remarkable. World War II veterans shared tables with those who had served in Korea, Vietnam, and more recent conflicts. Their stories flowed as freely as Sarah's coffee. "You know what amazes me most?" Harold said, looking around at the gathered crowd. "How one small choice can change so many lives." He glanced at Steele and his group. These boys could have stayed on their wrong path, but they chose to change. Now look at what they've created. The bikers had become the guardians of veterans' stories. They didn't just provide transportation. They visited veterans' homes regularly, helped maintain their gardens, and most importantly, listened to their stories. Each biker carried a notebook to write down the veterans' memories, determined that no tale of sacrifice would be forgotten. Mrs. Peterson, who now ran a weekly knitting circle that made blankets for veterans' homes, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched young children from the local school file in. The bikers had started a monthly program where veterans shared their experiences with students, teaching new generations about service, sacrifice, and redemption. "Commander," Steele said, standing up to address the crowd, "we got one more surprise." He nodded to his group, who wheeled in a large covered object. When they pulled off the cover, Harold's eyes filled with tears. It was a beautiful handcrafted wooden wall hanging featuring the Ghost Unit's insignia. Below it were the words, "Joe's Corner Cafe, where every veteran has a story and every story matters." "This cafe isn't just about coffee anymore," Steele continued, his voice strong with emotion. "It's about remembering. It's about respect. It's about making sure that no veteran ever feels forgotten." As the morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the silver in Harold's hair and the proud tears in Steele's eyes, Joe's Corner Cafe hummed with the voices of veterans sharing their stories. The aroma of coffee mixed with the smell of Mary's apple pie, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. Harold looked around at what his small act of courage had created, not by fighting back with fists, but by showing the power of dignity, wisdom, and forgiveness. In his 93 years, he had seen the worst of humanity in war, but here, in this small-town cafe, he was witnessing some of its best. The Ghost Commander had completed his final mission, not with weapons or tactics, but with understanding and compassion, and this victory would live on in the hearts of all who gathered at Joe's Corner Cafe.